right. Well, thank you so much, Paula, and welcome everyone here this evening. My name is Stephen Saum, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm the Executive Director for Strategic Communications and Content at St. Mary's College of California across the Bay. More important, your moderator this evening in our conversation with our guest. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Shadi Hamid is a columnist at The Washington Post and senior fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. His book, The Case for American Power, offers a pragmatic and timely analysis of America's past and current foreign policy and asks the provocative question, how should we think about the power we have while we still have it? Shadi, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let me start off by asking you about one of the points you make early on in the book, that the conclusion that American dominance is good, necessary, and likely to continue regardless, that's the right one. After Davos and what's happening in this country domestically, especially Minneapolis, is all of that true?
Yeah, so I think that it's getting to be a harder case to make in light of recent events. Let's just put it that way. I should just say that from the outset. People get the wrong idea sometimes when they look at the title. This is not in any way something that is sympathetic to Donald Trump. I actually see Donald Trump as undermining American power and undermining what makes this country great, and that's very frightening to me. But I also think that as bad as Trump is, we shouldn't let Trump's actions undermine our belief in the American project. That would be conceding the game to him. Because if we start getting hopeless and saying, America doesn't have a future, America shouldn't play a leadership role, America should retreat inward, then we're allowing Trump to reshape our understanding of America. And I think that the American project at home and abroad is worth believing in and fighting for regardless of what Trump does. And I do see Trump, I don't think he's an aberration. I think there's a real chance that someone like J.D. Vance could win in 2028. I mean, I certainly hope not. But what makes America great and what figures a lot in the book is the fact that we are a democracy. That means that we get the government we deserve and we get the foreign policy we deserve. So if we don't like what America is becoming, the great thing is we still have the means to change it by organizing, advocating, protesting, participating. So part of what this book is really a call especially to progressives, young people, other skeptics of American power, to tell them, don't exit the political game altogether. Don't give up on America, because if you do, then you're essentially, you're not going to be able to influence the outcomes you want to see. And for most of us, this is our only country, so I don't really see an alternative but participating, but hoping that America can improve, and that American power can be used for good and just ends. And so when I talk about American power, I think it has to be guided by a moral sensibility. Power without morality is what we're seeing now under Donald Trump. But morality without power is also a problem, because we can kind of retreat into our moral purity and moral righteousness, and then we wash our hands of power and we say we don't want to get our hands dirty, but then we're not actually affecting any change.
Right. Well, I mean, that seems to kind of play into the fact that the politics is about compromise to begin with, if you have a kind of functioning democratic system, at least, right? Yep. That it's not just a brute assertion of one point of view.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if the U.S. isn't playing a leadership role, motivated by ideals or trying to realize those ideals, however imperfectly, what are the alternatives that you see and that you stake out here?
Yeah, so I think that in some ways there isn't a real alternative. I think for the rest of our lives, for most of the rest of our lives, for the foreseeable future, American power will be uncontested. I mean, we can talk about China all we want. We've been talking about the rise of China for the entirety of my adult life. It seems to always be rising. But I think there's a limit to how far China can go. I mean, its military budget is still about a fifth of America's. Its GDP per capita is about a sixth of what America's is. China is not a rich country on a per capita level. There are still large swaths of China that are actually quite poor. In that sense, China is still a developing country. But I think the fact that China is a brutal authoritarian regime also means that it has real limits, because the thing about autocratic regimes is that they can sometimes seem appealing, because you have the autocrat, the dear leader, the dictator. He's able, in China was able to build hospitals in a very short period of time during the COVID period, as I think a lot of us saw, and we were envious of that. Why can't we be as efficient as China? But I think the dark side of that is when the leader starts making mistakes, there are no means for self-correction. If you're a Chinese citizen and you're angry or disappointed or frustrated with what your government is doing, there is no parliament, there are no political parties, there is no freedom of expression, there is no right to petition your elected officials. So in that sense, China has this inherent weakness, which I think puts it at a severe disadvantage compared to the US, that it can't self-correct the way that we do. I still very much believe that we will self-correct, that more and more Americans are seeing the excesses of the Trump administration, and they're saying, actually, we don't want to go this far. Enough is enough. And I think that self-correction is at the heart of the American project. And I think also as a child of immigrants, I should say, my parents grew up under an authoritarian regime in Egypt. And having lived also for several years in the Middle East at different points of my life, we take for granted what we have in this country because so many of us have not seen the alternative with our own eyes. And having seen that alternative, my argument to American audiences is always, don't take this for granted. As flawed and faulty as our democracy is, it is still a remarkable thing to be able to criticize your own leader and to be able to protest and advocate. And obviously, Trump wants to restrict our right to protest. He won't be able to do that because we have a Bill of Rights, we have a First Amendment, and I think that I can be a more effective, I think, channel for this kind of argument because of my background, because I have seen the alternative.
So what about, if we're talking about America on the world stage, what does it look like to you, a U.S. divorced from ideals, still exercising power on the world stage?
Yeah, so I think what it looks like is precisely what we're seeing now. And I think this is the first time really in our history that we have a president who doesn't even pretend to talk about American ideals. There is no talk about supporting democracy abroad. There is no talk about the importance of human rights. Donald Trump says it very clearly, might makes right. Power and brute force, as you mentioned, is all that matters. And we are a country founded on a distinct moral mission. Each and every president until Donald Trump, now we haven't always lived up to those ideals, but we've at least talked about them. It's part of our rhetorical frame. And I think that rhetoric is very important because it reminds Americans of what we can aspire to. And I have a whole chapter in the book on hypocrisy, and I actually argue that in a kind of counterintuitive way, hypocrisy can be useful. Hypocrisy is the cost of trying to be better than we actually are. And then with a hypocrisy gap, we can remind our leaders, like, hey, there is still this ideal, and we're capable of that ideal. If you look at countries like China or Russia, they're not really criticized so much for their hypocrisy because they don't really have that moral aspiration. it's not confusing to us when we see China being a brutally autocratic regime. That's exactly what China is expected to be. They're not pretending to be a democracy. Russia is not pretending to be a democracy. What you see is what you get. And some people might say that maybe what you see is what you get might be better, but I actually don't think that's the case, because what you see is what you get is what we have under Donald Trump. There is no hypocrisy with him. The mask has come off completely, and I don't think that's actually a useful way to approach American power. I would rather our leaders speak about the pretense, and there's a famous quote by the French author Francois La Rochefoucauld, which some of you may have heard: hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. To be virtuous, there's always going to be some vice, and it's in the gap between who we are and who we want to be. That is where there's real potential. That's where we can always still try to be better.
Well, so let me kind of dig in a little bit on coming back to Russia and democracy, because there are elections that Russia's had, and myself, having worked as an election observer in different countries over the years, like in Ukraine when Zelensky was elected. Like I know when the OSCE has said, yeah, this has been a free and fair election, versus in Belarus, where you're exercising, there's the charade that's taking place. I'm wondering if you can talk about democracy as maybe as performance versus as substance.
Yeah, well, there's always a performative aspect with democracy, is that you are presenting yourself to citizens, and there is a kind of theater to it. Because we're not a perfect democracy, we're not a pure democracy here at home. There are, obviously, the role that money plays in our own system has a distorting effect. And let's not pretend that each of us has an equal say or equal input into our political system, but there is the pretense that all of us are equal. I think that pretense, which is something that's there in our founding documents, the pretense reminds us of something important, that we should be equal, we can be equal, and that there is this process of self-correction and self-perfection, that we're always trying to be a more perfect union. And a lot of that might sound naive, it might sound, like that's the kind of thing that we heard about or read about in social studies class and all that. But what else do we have? If we give up hope in these American ideals, then again, we're stuck with the Donald Trump approach, which is one of brute force. But I would also remind folks that even if there is a lot of theater, it is real. The very fact that someone like Donald Trump could win not just one election, but 2 elections, that's a frightening outcome for me. I did not want to see that happen, but it shows that even someone who had no chance of winning, in his first term, he was running a campaign that had that had the support of maybe 1 or 2% early on. And the fact that he could rise to become our president shows that anything is possible in a democracy. To kind of take it from the other side, maybe one that's a little bit more positive, the fact that Zohran Mamdani also started out with 0% support in the New York mayoral race, but was able to become the leader. It's remarkable for someone who's 34 years old, a person of color, a Muslim, to be the leader of the potentially the most important city in the world, or the second most important city in the world behind DC, depending on your perspective. I mean, that is a remarkable thing. So it shows that our democracy is still very much alive, it's vibrant, and there's real competition. And there are more and more young people, progressives, who are trying to run for office on the local level, in part because, and I think Gaza looms over a big part of my book, and we can talk more about that, but I think that a lot of young people who have been very frustrated by our country's policies on Gaza, they're saying, hey, we're not going to stay quiet, we're actually going to run for local office, and we're going to be unapologetically pro-Palestine. And I think that shows a new kind of grassroots movement that is emerging. So all of this shows is that our democracy is very much in flux, it's alive, and that's something to remember even now in this dark moment.
So When you're talking about young people now in this moment, and I think about that a lot. Our son who lives in Minneapolis, right? Kind of what it's been like every day. You yourself, you write about in this book because there's an aspect of memoir to it, sort of kind of your awakening politically and kind of coming to understand the role of America in the world. Being a freshman in college in 2001 when the attacks happened in New York and D.C. And then the U.S. reaction to that, and being a young Muslim man in America and what that was like.
Yeah. So there is quite a bit of my own personal story in the book. It's kind of, in this sense, it's kind of an anguished manifesto. I have a vision for what I want things to be, but I'm struggling with a lot of these issues because I have had to struggle. I've wrestled with these topics, and there was a moment during the Gaza war when I was revising the book, and I thought to myself, do I still feel comfortable making the case for American power despite what I think is America's enabling of Israel's atrocities and the fact that we have not just turned a blind eye, but actually made it possible. And that's been hard, and I've wondered, can I make the case or not? But to kind of go back a little bit, I was a freshman in college when 9/11 happened, and 9/11 changed my life. I decided to go into politics and policy, and I wanted to become a writer. I wanted to understand how something like this could have happened. Why was the Middle East this kind of font of chaos and civil conflict? And why was there extremism? And I wanted to answer all of those questions, but I was also angry at the U.S. because of the civil rights abuses after 9/11, but also the Iraq War. And I cut my political chops during the Iraq War. I was very involved in the anti-war movement. I organized a die-in on campus. I helped organize a small tent encampment before tent encampments were cool, but we just had one or two tents. It was very small. Yeah. It was a very small tent encampment. But like a lot of people in college, I went through a pseudo-socialist stage. I was reading people like Noam Chomsky, and I thought America was a source of evil and destruction. And I should say, America has done a lot of terrible things in the world, especially in the Middle East, including the Iraq War, including our support for Arab dictatorships for the better part of 7 decades. We've supported these authoritarian regimes, including my country of origin, Egypt. So there was always a question that I was asking myself, why do we support these authoritarian regimes? We say we believe in democracy, but we don't actually support it abroad. And so but I think for me, there was a realization that we were protesting against the Iraq War. There was actually this one day of coordinated protest in February 2003. Some of you might remember it. It was a beautiful moment, and I actually was naive enough to think that we could stop the war. But we couldn't, and we didn't. And I had to ask myself, do I want to be powerless? Do I want to be on the outside looking in for the rest of my life? Do I want to be one of those people who goes outside of the White House every week with a sign? And I thought to myself that the better way is to be engaged in the policy conversation, to talk to people in government, to write for a larger audience and try to influence how people discuss American power. And I think that's a choice that a lot of us can make. There is a role for being a protester, but there's also a role for working within the system. And what I think I also realized was America hasn't always been a force for good in the world, but we have done good things occasionally. And what I try to lay out in the book is a lot of the things that we take for granted, that the post-World War order that America helped build and create, that was actually something that we should be proud of, that at the end of World War II, only about 8% of the world's countries were democracies. By the 1990s, that number went up to over 50%. And that wouldn't have been possible without the demonstration effect that America had. Because we were the sole superpower in the 1990s, we saw the third wave of democratization. We saw democracy spread through Eastern Europe and also throughout Latin America, parts of Africa. And that is something that America helped facilitate. There's also the fact that under American dominance, battlefield deaths declined significantly. For most of the Cold War, there was a drop in battlefield deaths to about 180,000 annually as an average. But in the 1990s, after the Cold War, that number dropped to about 50,000 battlefield deaths per year. So a major drop. And again, that wouldn't have been possible without America being the dominant superpower, because we were preserving this so-called rules-based international order and also helping Europe rebuild after World War II, paving the way for the establishment of the European Union, because we provided Europe with a security umbrella. There were also good interventions that we helped facilitate, because we always think about the bad ones, like Iraq and Afghanistan, but there were 3 important interventions in the 1990s at the peak of American power where we helped end the Bosnian genocide. We helped end the ethnic cleansing through military force in Kosovo. We intervened militarily against Saddam Hussein's invasion and occupation of Kuwait. So America is capable of using military power for worthy ends. And again, these things they might seem obvious, but they're also forgotten. So I think this book is also a reminder of, hey, America has sometimes done the right thing. We don't always do the right thing. But just because we've made a lot of mistakes in the past doesn't mean we're doomed to repeat them in the future. So there is this kind of checkered history that I think we have to be aware of. There's good and there's bad, but let's remember the good.
And you talk about in this book sort of a problem more on the left than on the right, a tendency to only see the bad, and you even use the term coined by Roger Scruton, the philosopher, oikophobia. Talk about that, because that may be something new, I think, to a lot of our audience.
Oikophobia is a really interesting concept. Probably most of you are familiar with xenophobia. Xenophobia is the fear of what is foreign, the fear of what is different, of other. Oikophobia is the reverse of that. Oikophobia is the fear of what is home and what is familiar. And I think we're seeing this, especially on the left in progressive spaces over the last few years, that there is a kind of self-contempt, a self-loathing that I think is very unhealthy. And there's actually a remarkable poll that came out recently from Gallup. So in the early 2000s, around 2004, the number of Democrats who said they were either extremely or very proud to be American was hovering at around 85%, very high. In 2025, that number dropped to only 36% of Democrats saying they were either extremely or very proud to be American. It's one of the most precipitous drops in polling that I've ever seen. Something has really changed over the last 25 years. It used to be somewhat equal. Democrats and Republicans were equally proud to be American. But now there's a major partisan gap where Democrats, and especially young Democrats, young progressives, young liberals, are not proud anymore to be American. And so I really felt that I want to be able to send a message. I want to be able to make a case that despite all of our faults and flaws, we should still be proud of our country. And there were times over the past few years where I would say things to some of my young liberal friends. I would use the word love to describe my feelings for America. I would say, I love America. And I would have, especially white liberal friends, saying to me, Shadi, what are you doing? You're a person of color, you're Muslim, you're Arab. How can you be using this kind of love language when talking about America? But that really felt to be like something to be worried about. If we don't love our country, how are we going to be able to change it, to improve it? And I think often of the great quote from James Baldwin, when he says, this is a paraphrase, it's it's precisely because I love my country that I insist on the right to criticize it perpetually. So love of country should go hand in hand with criticizing your country. Just because you're critical doesn't mean you don't love your country. And I think we've lost sight of that.
One of the other disturbing polls that you mention in here is those who believe in the importance of democracy. I mean, you cite a number among younger generations versus, say, those born before World War II. Is democracy even a high priority?
Yeah, there's growing numbers, especially of young people in America, who say that they would be comfortable with strongman rule or military rule. They don't act. Sorry?
They don't know what it is.
No, yeah. They don't. Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. They don't realize what it really means to live under strongman rule, under a dictatorship, and having lived under a couple dictatorships in the Middle East. It's a very different way of life, and it's one where people don't have ownership over their own country. There isn't really a sense of hope and a possibility for improvement. You can't say anything. You can't do anything. You're powerless. And I think people look at countries like China or Russia, and it goes back to what I said earlier about China's efficient. China gets things done. If we had a strongman, we could just build things very quickly. So I think this is something we have to really push back against, this idea of the benevolent dictator, of the efficient autocrat. Most autocracies are not efficient. If we look at most of the world, most autocracies are failures. They're relatively poor. China is maybe an example of maybe more relative success, but most countries aren't China. Most countries are more like Egypt, which is not a very successful case to point to. So I think it is important for all of us to, not to say that like we're older and we speak to young people. I'm still relatively young myself, but it does, I think it has been a major point of concern when I look at people my age or younger and I see that they're giving up hope because they see someone like Donald Trump, because they see ICE's actions in Minneapolis. I think that they have, at the end of the day, America is preferable to the alternatives, and this goes back to the kind of comparative aspect of my argument, is that America is preferable to China and Russia. We're not morally equivalent. I think there's sometimes a tendency to say America is just as bad as these other countries.
Right.
But we have to be comfortable saying that we are better, that we are morally superior. We have to use that kind of language. And there's also something to be said for just being proud of the country that you were born and raised in, even if there are a lot of flaws. Like, we should want our country to be successful. We should want our own country to be powerful in world affairs.
Well, I think one of the points that you make is that, when there are nascent democratic uprisings, right, they will not turn to Russia for help and support for protests, or they will not turn to China. They will turn to the United States, or even recently in Iran, sort of like, where are you, right? If you're going to support us, where are you?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I was in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring in Egypt when the dictator of 30 years fell, Mubarak. And I remember spending time with the protesters in Tahrir Square, and they were begging for the U.S. to get involved and put pressure on the Egyptian military to let go of Mubarak. And when Obama gave a couple major primetime speeches, they were hanging on his every word. And in some sense, they believed in us. They believed that America might do the right thing. And for a moment, we did. Obama did put pressure on Mubarak to step down. Also, during the Syrian uprising in 2011 and 2012, Syrian opposition, the Syrian protesters, they weren't looking to China or Russia for support. They were begging the U.S. to get involved. or the Libyan opposition protesters when they were being gunned down by Gaddafi's regime in March 2011. They were again begging the U.S. to intervene militarily, which we ultimately did. Now, we can debate whether or not the result was positive, but it just shows something that even Iranian protesters now, there's a sense of, is America on our side? Can America offer rhetorical support? America, because it has these values of democracy and freedom, we should stand with others who are fighting for their own freedom and democracy. So there is a sense throughout the world that America is a kind of aspirational state, that we have ideas and ideals. Most countries in the world only protect their very narrow national security interests. They don't actually have an ideology beyond themselves, beyond their own survival. America then is quite special and quite unusual, quite exceptional, if we can use that word. And we should actually, I think, have some pride in that exceptionalism. Again, it's not fashionable to say these things. To talk about American exceptionalism is cliche and naive and the kind of thing that we would talk about in the 1990s. But I think it is simply a fact that America is distinctive compared to other countries precisely because we have these ideas of liberty and freedom and that we want to share them with more people in other parts of the world. Now, we don't always live up to that. Again, there is this gap between ideals and reality, but at least we have those ideals.
Yeah, well, so if I'm understanding right, also you very much make the case the exceptionalism is entwined with a sense of responsibility, right? So you have this power, right? You could do something, right? You could actually exercise your ideals or bolster those ideals, stand with, friends in Ukraine would say, yes, you could support us more as we're trying to resist a war of aggression.
Yeah, and in those cases, words aren't enough. I mean, there is a role for military power. I mean, when I use the word power in the book, there are many different kinds of power that we can talk about. Soft power, diplomatic influence, putting pressure on our allies to open up their political systems and to become more democratic and to respect human rights. But there is also a role for hard power sometimes, for military power. And going back to the interventions I mentioned in the 1990s, or the fact that we should support Ukraine militarily, that's very much my belief, that Russia isn't going to respect just words. Ultimately, military force is something that Russia will take seriously, or the threat of military force. China's increasing aggression towards Taiwan. If they see that America has a large military budget, if they see that America has a powerful military, that makes them think twice about their actions. Because morality on its own without the credible threat of military force is just words. It's just ideals. Ideals are a lot, but they have to be backed by something in the end.
I also found myself thinking of the phrase that Churchill, popularized, the notion that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others.
Exactly. Yeah.
So talk some more. So you brought up Tahrir Square, right? And you mentioned Egypt a couple of times. Talk some more about the Arab Spring, and because it's clear as those of us who lived through it and saw it, and you know better than others. So democracy is not a panacea for solving all problems. Talk about the Arab Spring and democracy, especially in Egypt.
So I'm very much a believer in the idea that democracy is the right to make the wrong choice. And what happened during the Arab Spring in countries like Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere is that parties that we didn't necessarily like as Americans, parties that didn't share our values, right-wing religious parties did quite well. The Muslim Brotherhood won several elections, consecutive elections in Egypt during that period from 2011 to 2013. And so you might say, oh, look, here's an Islamist party, a religiously influenced party like the Muslim Brotherhood. If they win, then democracy's bad, because we should want people who are like us, like liberals, pro-American, and so forth, to win elections. But one thing I try to remind people is that we have similar problems in American democracy. We had a right-wing populist party, the Republican Party, and Donald Trump win an election, and I think a lot of us, me for one, see that as a threat to so much of what I hold dear. But I think that Americans have the right to vote for people like Donald Trump. They have the right to make the wrong choice. Also in Europe, we see the rise of right-wing populist parties throughout Europe. So democracy is about acknowledging that you give people the right to vote, you have different parties competing, and sometimes you don't like the result, but you have to respect the result even if you don't like it. I think that was a real mistake during the Arab Spring, that American policymakers looked at who was winning and they said, we don't like who's winning. Actually, democracy, never mind. We're not going to be as supportive of that. I don't think that's the right approach. Democracy is messy. It's chaotic. You don't get to perfect democracy overnight. We went through a civil war in our own country. It took us a long time to actually have protection for minority rights, to actually have full equal rights. That required several amendments. It required actually this process of self-improvement over 200 years. So I think this idea, when we look at a place like the Middle East and we say, why can't they be democratic and they kind of have this perfect democracy right away, it's not going to get there right away, just like we didn't get there immediately either.
Well, and there's certainly you can introduce, if you've been living in an authoritarian regime, right? So suddenly there's this instability, there's this uncertainty, and maybe the economy isn't as solid as it had been. I mean, here I'm thinking again my experience in Central and Eastern Europe, and there was even a conference I was at back in '99 where Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl and Gorbachev were there. I had a chance to ask a question. What do you say to people who are disappointed by all the promises that were made, like democracy and capitalism will bring this great, it'll be like a holiday. Margaret Thatcher gave like the quintessential Margaret Thatcher answer, which was cheer up, right? Which is not so helpful, right? So what would your answer be to that?
Yeah, it's hard to tell people who are suffering if their economic situation isn't improving, to tell them to kind of stick with it. But I think that counseling patients is what we have to kind of readjust people's expectations and say democracy isn't going to produce economic results overnight, that it will take time, and it's better to wait than to return to strongman rule, because dictatorships aren't that good in delivering economic benefits either. They can be failures when it comes to economic growth and economic development. So it's sort of a be careful what you wish for. There is this illusion that the strong man is going to give you what you want, but the strong man often promises things that he can't deliver. And we have seen that in places like Egypt, that after Egypt ended its democratic experiment and returned to military dictatorship, the economy actually got worse. Inflation rose by a remarkable amount. The economy is teetering on the brink. So, but granted, that might not be enough to persuade people that democracy is better, but I think there is a message that democracy means that you can criticize your own leaders, and there's something beautiful about that. There's something beautiful about rotation of power, of saying that you actually want another party to take the place of the party that's currently in power. That's what democracy offers. It offers the possibility of change, and I think we have to remind people of that and make the case that that's better than the alternative.
So here's a question very much kind of digging in on the flawed aspect. A member of the audience wants to know, what do you say to someone who questions American democracy on the basis that a lack of investment in education and critical thinking leads to mass manipulation of voters, especially to lobby or kind of particular media interests, kind of for the sake of private interests, right?
The role that private interests play and that companies and firms and billionaires play in the American system is worse than a lot of other democracies. I mean, there are more restrictions on the role that money can play in European democracies. So we have a problem that's somewhat distinctive, and some of that has to do with Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United that allowed for a greater role of dark money in our public politics. There isn't a great answer to, I mean, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. There is going to be a role for dark money, for billionaires to distort our political system. But I think that there's a limit to how far that can go, because ultimately, if you want to win an election, you need to actually get the votes of Americans. And that's something that money can't necessarily buy. I mean, we saw in the previous election cycle, someone like former Mayor Michael Bloomberg trying to win with his billions of dollars, but ultimately he wasn't able to persuade enough Americans that his campaign was viable. The fact that Bernie Sanders has been able to do quite well and almost get the Democratic nomination in 2016 and 2020, despite having very little support from the billionaire class, if you will, that also shows that there's something to be said for people power. That if you have enough small donors, and if they're able to coalesce and organize and participate, similar with Zohran Mamdani, who was opposed by most of the billionaires who live in New York City, and now they're all going to get a tax hike that he just announced recently. So that, again, it shows you that there is that people power can actually win out over the role of money in our politics. But what it does require is collective action. It does require voters actually voting and people organizing and protesting and participating. And if you have the power of numbers, that is a real power that you can have over the political process. But again, if people exit the political system and they have a very negative approach and they say, America is hopeless, America is going on this dark path, and then they say we're not going to participate in politics because they want to be morally pure, then I think that obviously billionaires and tech companies and others are going to dominate our politics in a way that I think is very negative. So that part is up to us. Again, we get the democracy we deserve, we get the government we deserve.
Well, so you brought up the question of dark money. Here's someone who wants to ask about foreign lobbies and potentially foreign money in interfering or reframing American democracy. Does this undermine the legitimate use of American power, and how do we counter that? They give the example of AIPAC, for example.
Yeah, and I've been a critic of AIPAC's role. I think that AIPAC does distort our politics, but I think that's also changing. I think there's been a kind of awakening in American politics over the past 2 years. If you look at polling, now the vast majority of the Democratic Party supports suspending aid to Israel. If you look especially at young Democrats, the numbers are even higher when it comes to having a more balanced approach to Israel-Palestine. And I'm not necessarily saying that we cut off Israel entirely. I think we have to be realistic that Israel is probably going to still continue being an ally for the foreseeable future. But my argument has always been that if Israel is receiving billions of dollars of aid from the U.S., we should expect something in return. And we should be able to say, kill less civilians, respect the ceasefire, don't violate the ceasefire, help to allow aid to come back into Gaza so people can rebuild their lives and their homes. If Israel refuses to do that, then we shouldn't, in my view, continue giving them aid to the tune of billions of dollars. So that, to me, is what it means to use our power. We use our power for good. We use our power to influence countries like Israel to change their behavior and change their policy, just like we would do with other countries in the Middle East, like Egypt or Saudi Arabia, that do destructive things in the region. Saudi Arabia supported a brutal war in Yemen for many years, which didn't get a lot of attention. We should have used our aid to Saudi Arabia and the weapon sales and the billions of dollars of weapons that we were giving them to say, again, don't, if you continue doing this, we won't sell you weapons. But it is positive to me that the Democratic Party, I mentioned obviously Zohran Mamdani, someone who's been unapologetic in his support for Palestine. The fact that he can win, the fact that others who are running can win with a pro-Palestine message, it doesn't even have to be pro-Palestine. It just should be balanced. That we should put pressure on our friends, and if Israel is a friend, we should put pressure on them to change their behavior. So I think that AIPAC's hold on our politics is being challenged in a very serious way, and my hope is that in 5 or 10 or 15 years, we'll see a transformed Democratic Party that is actually that has a much more reasonable policy on these kinds of questions. Gaza will continue to be a major issue in our politics for the foreseeable future. It'll take years, if not decades, for Gaza to rebuild itself.
So here's a question that kind of on the global stage that sort of seems even more poignant in the wake of the Greenland crisis and Davos. Will the U.S. deteriorate the rules-based international order if it continues operating as it is under this administration? And if eroded, will someone else fill the void?
Yeah, I think that ultimately that is really up to us. If Donald Trump or someone like him keeps on winning, I do think that America will continue to decline. And we're seeing how European countries are actually becoming very skeptical about America's role. Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada gave a very powerful speech at Davos where he questioned whether or not Europe can count on American promises going forward, whether something has fundamentally ended, that the old era of the rules-based international order has come to a close. And Mark Carney and I think others are trying to strengthen their relationships with China because they see America maybe not being a sure thing anymore. But I think that would be again, I'm skeptical that China can really replace the U.S. in that regard, but I think it also shows that when other countries like China and Russia, when they see American weakness, they do try to step into the void. And that's something we have to be very concerned about. And we have to ask ourselves, do we want to allow that to happen? Is that the kind of world that we want to see? Is a world where China and Russia are playing more of a role? Is that going to be a better world or not? And my argument is that it won't be a better world if China is dominating, because China doesn't have the same kind of values that America does. But we have to rediscover those values, and that's only going to happen if Trump. If Democrats win, I don't think this current Republican Party is really going to be able to meld power and morality together. This Republican Party, unless it's able to shake off the hold of Trump and Trump's ideas, I think we're going to continue to see this slow decline.
So if I'm remembering right, you actually talk about in the book, when you're talking about Donald Trump, you say at heart he's no moralist, he's a mercantilist.
Yeah.
So explain what you mean by that.
He's someone who cares about economic transactions. That's all he seems to care about. There are no ideals that are guiding him. He doesn't seem to have a moral fiber in his body. He just wants to make a deal. And maybe that can be helpful sometimes. Maybe it's good to make a deal every now and then. But that can't be a substitute for a vision of America's role in the world that takes ideas and ideals seriously. But he has no interest in that. And he thinks that he can use brute force to pressure people to make deals that they don't want to make. That's what he was trying to do on Greenland, using all this bellicose language and rhetoric, thinking that he could bully Europe into some kind of deal on Greenland. But ultimately, people don't want to feel bullied. They want to feel like they're part of something. And that's actually one of the definitions of power that we use in political science, which is power is the ability of A to get B to do something they would otherwise not do. But the way you get them to do something they would otherwise not do is not just through brute force. It's by persuading them. The role of persuasion is very important. Otherwise, people are going to feel like they had no say in the matter, like they're being pushed along. And I think this is where the role of soft power and cultural influence becomes really important. We have to inspire people, inspire other countries, instead of forcing them to do things that we want them to do, that they don't want to do.
Well, of course, soft power is harder to exercise if you've dismantled an agency like the USAID.
Yeah.
You yourself were a recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship.
Yeah.
And actually one of the members of the audience says, can you talk more about your personal experience in the Middle East and how that's, the time that you've spent there and how that's really shaped what you brought to this book?
Yeah. So I did a Fulbright in Jordan. So I lived there for about an academic year, so about 9 months. And that was really a key moment in my life, is doing a research project in a foreign country as an American. And I think it's those kinds of cultural exchanges that are really such an important part of my life, but the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans who have taken part in those kinds of activities over the past few decades. And I think there's a real risk that we're dismantling those kinds of projects, those kinds of exchanges. And the fact that USAID is no longer effectively, all of those things suggest that our cultural influence is going to decrease. I was also the recipient of a Marshall Scholarship, which allowed me to do my PhD in England. There are a lot of these things that really go unnoticed and don't get a lot of attention, but they're really a way for Americans to connect with the rest of the world, for us to understand the rest of the world. And I wouldn't be here today if I didn't understand the Middle East, if I didn't understand how people in that region view the world and their own criticisms of American policy. And I could see the anger that so many people had in Egypt, in Jordan. And they said, why can't America live up to its moral purpose? You guys talk so much about your ideals. Why can't you actually live up to them? And to hear that for time and time again, it really kind of entrenches itself in your mind. And that's something that has guided me in my own work over the past 20 years throughout my adult life, which is America is capable of being better than it actually is. During the Cold War, even though America helped rebuild Europe during the Cold War, and we provided that security umbrella to our European allies, we also did a lot of bad things in Latin America, where we supported, where we helped overthrow democratically elected governments. There is that tragic history. But I think it's going back to the Baldwin quote, you have to criticize those things. And I try to catalog those sins. I try to be very clear that we have done a lot of bad things in the world. But again, just because we've done bad things in the past doesn't mean we have to repeat them in the future. I mean, that's the mantra that I try to remind people of, that it doesn't always have to be that way.
You mentioned the Mark Carney speech in Davos. I was struck when I saw in the wake of that a career U.S. diplomat, Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, who was actually under Antony Blinken, was the first DEI officer ever appointed for the State Department. But her comments on that were, this was a powerful speech. These are American values, was what she was, she was recognizing so much in there. And one of the members of the audience here wants to know, what about other democracies like Canada, New Zealand, and Scandinavia? Maybe we should strive to be more like a middle power country like they are.
That would mean accepting our own decline. And I think that it would be unfortunate if we're the most powerful country in the world and then we actually facilitate our own decline. That would be a kind of odd thing, to try to be weaker than we actually are and to give up our power. And again, I think what that would only do, it would encourage and embolden countries like China and Russia and other challengers to be more aggressive in the world stage. I mean, one thing that I talk about is how Russia under Putin perceived American weakness time and time again. They invaded Georgia in 2008. There was a very weak U.S. response. I think Putin took that as a message that he could be more aggressive and that we wouldn't do anything. So when he invaded Crimea several years later, again, we kind of let him do it. When Russia joined the Syrian civil war and intervened on the behalf of the Assad regime in September 2015, the U.S. again kind of didn't do much in response. So I think there is a risk that when countries get aggressive and America allows it to happen and doesn't respond, it just emboldens these countries to do more and to cause more havoc in the international arena. And I think that's what we would see more of in a world where American power was much weaker, where we accepted a role as a middle power. But I also don't think we can be a middle power even if we wanted to, because our economy is so strong, because our economy is so intertwined with other economies throughout the world. America's economy continues to grow at a pretty impressive clip. So as bad as Donald Trump is, there is still tremendous economic growth and technological innovation. So we're going to still be the world's economic powerhouse regardless. So we should try to use that kind of power for good while we have it. I don't think America will be the dominant superpower for the rest of eternity. All empires fall. I just don't think that's likely to happen in our lifetimes. But will it happen in 100 years or 150 years? But we'll all be dead by then. So, I mean, it's sort of a question of let's not think about that or assume that's going to happen, because it probably won't happen during our lifetime.
Well, so if we're talking about a growing economy, certainly one of the factors that's part of that in the U.S., because the U.S., we also see a continuing population growth, which is not the case in all democracies. But I think that one of the points you make is in the U.S., actually, the population would not be growing if it weren't for immigration.
Yeah. Yeah, so in the epilogue, this is my more sort of positive view of what's to come and what America has that other countries don't. China, I think one of its biggest weaknesses, in addition to the fact that it's an autocratic regime that's kind of misaligned with the aspirations of its own citizens, China is shrinking. Its population is quite literally shrinking. Its birth rate is around 1.1. And to actually sustain your own population, you have to have a birth rate of 2.1. So China, at this current rate, is going to lose hundreds of millions of people over the next 30 or 40 years. It's going to be really a remarkable shift. Now, China is trying to incentivize families to have more kids, but it's very difficult to do that, and it's very difficult to undo the decline. Now, the only thing that you can really do is, if your birth rate is shrinking so much, is to make up the gap in immigration. But because China doesn't allow people to become Chinese citizens, it doesn't really have any way to replenish its population. That is a strength that America has. We're also below replacement rate of 2.1, which means that if we don't have immigration, we're going to eventually start shrinking by around 2080. And if Trump has his way and Republicans have their way, and we're at net zero immigration, we'll start shrinking sooner than 2080. But at least we have the potential to bring in people from other parts of the world. People still want to come to America. That's the remarkable thing. There is still this desire for people to become American. And I actually had the privilege of seeing my own parents become American. There's something very powerful about seeing that process, that being American isn't about blood and soil, it's actually about subscribing to our American ideals that are available to everyone. And that means that our population can continue to grow if we open up, not to say that everyone should be able to become American, but we should be able to bring in high-skilled people who are able to bring something to our economy. And I worry that under this current government, we're losing sight of that, and this has major implications for whether our country can grow going forward in the decades to come.
So shifting gears considerably, and the flip side of the question about the U.S. becoming a middle power, should the U.S. engage in regime change, this audience member asks, for example, in Iran?
So this goes back to whether there are some good interventions, but there's also bad interventions, and the most obvious one is Iraq. We've seen how, which I consider to be one of the great historic blunders, we've seen what happens when we try to completely transform a country and rebuild it from scratch. It doesn't work out that well. So if there was a way to help Iranians shake off the hold of their authoritarian regime, I would be in favor of it. I just don't think that there's an obvious way of doing it. We don't really have leverage with the Iranian regime. They're not an ally, so we can't influence them politically or financially. And if we just try to decapitate a regime, then the question is, what takes its place? And so I think we have to be very careful about making those same mistakes again. But I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we should do whatever we can to encourage the protesters to, again, there's not a lot we can actually do short of airstrikes. And again, I don't think that's necessarily going to lead to a better outcome, because what takes the place of the regime that's currently in power? So I think that we have to be very careful about regime change interventions. And that's something that I counsel against in the book, that American power doesn't mean going around and toppling regimes that we don't like, because we've seen what a blunder that can be. And it taints the idea of America's role in the world, because people see the destruction that came about as a result of the Iraq intervention, and they say, well, that's actually, I think, one of the things that promoted American decline from 2003 onwards, is people saw what happened in Iraq, and they started to lose faith in America's role in the world. And Americans, as we talked about earlier, started to lose faith in America's own role in the world.
So here's an audience member that wants to know your thoughts on the 2026, the National Defense Strategy. If that is an articulation of a withdrawing of American power from a more global stage to more regional interests, right? Focus on Venezuela and drugs and oil.
Yeah, it was a remarkable document. I'd recommend people take a look at it. It's a 2026 National Security Strategy of the Trump administration. there is almost nothing about supporting democracy abroad. If you do a Control F to see how often democracy, the word, comes up, it only comes up once or twice in a different kind of context. Actually, in the context of Europe, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because Europe is already democratic. But I think that when I read it for the first time, I was really struck by this change of tone. There's no pretense. There's no sense of higher aspiration. There's no sense of morality. There's really none of that. It's about narrow national security interests. It's just about countering the drug trade. It's about transactional diplomacy. It's about cutting economic deals. And again, some of that can be positive, but that's not really a replacement for a vision. You need to actually have a vision that animates you and inspires Americans, and there was very little of that in the national security strategy. It's really a change of tone. There's really nothing like it, and it shows that this Trump administration is really able to change American foreign policy very quickly. Just in the span of a year, we've seen a massive transformation in terms of dismantling certain American institutions like USAID and changing the entire national security strategy in a way that it just doesn't bear any resemblance to what came before.
So one of the audience members wants to know if you can talk about some of the challenges and maybe dangers facing you and colleagues in journalism at this point.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It is scary when you start to feel like you don't have the freedom to say whatever you want, and this is especially the case for people who aren't American citizens. We've had a number of cases under the Rubio State Department where green card holders have been threatened with deportation or actually deported for pro-Palestine speech. And I think there is a real danger. Anti-Semitism is real, but using the threat of anti-Semitism as a cudgel to demonize pro-Palestine speech is really concerning to me. And we should be able to separate between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. Those are two very different things. They're not the same, and I think there's really been an effort to conflate them and to say that anyone who criticizes Israel is attacking Jews, which is not the case. Israel is a state. Jews are a people. It's two very different things, and we should resist that conflation as much as possible. But what the fact that we have to kind of we have to watch our backs in this sense that we have to be careful about what we say under the Trump administration, especially if you're not a citizen. This goes against everything this country stands for. And when it also comes to American citizens in tent encampments who were protesting on their campuses, and they were actually pressured to not do that and being penalized in their own universities, and some of them actually being disenrolled for their own participation in what is constitutionally protected speech. There's really a chill that I think is happening in our campuses and in our public debate around these questions of Israel and Palestine. And it's a very scary thing, and we have to resist that.
So we have time for just one more question here as we wrap up. In this fraught political moment, fraught moment for American democracy, what's the lesson that you hope people take away from this?
If I had one message for people, it would be America is worth fighting for. It's worth believing in. It's all we have. There is no real alternative to it. To the extent that there are alternatives, they're worse. And this is our country too, for most of us who are American citizens, which I presume most of you are, that this is our country. It is what we have. We should actually care about it. We should want to make it better, and we should stay in the system and participate. I assume most of you, just by virtue of the fact that you're here at the Commonwealth Club, that you are people who want to participate in politics. What I do worry about is young people, and especially young progressives, who don't love their country, who aren't as proud as they once were. And so my message is also to them, I would say even primarily to them, to say, run for office, support people who are running for office. If you don't like this country's policies, try to change them by working within the system. The system doesn't necessarily work perfectly, but at least we have a system, and at least we have democratic competition, and 2028 is going to be the key test of what this country looks like. And if we don't do everything we can to change what things look like in 2028, then we're only going to have ourselves to blame. So we have to have a more hopeful. There's a danger there. There's a kind of frightening aspect to it, but there should also be a hopeful message that there's something joyful about democracy. If democracy works, then there's something that's really exciting about it. But again, we'll have to wait and see what that actually looks like in the years to come.
All right. Well, our thanks to Shadi Hamid, author of The Case for American Power. We encourage you to pick up a copy of Shadi's book here or at your local bookstore. And for information about Commonwealth Club World Affairs programs, please visit the web at commonwealthclub.org. I'm Stephen Saum. Thank you to our audience here. Thank you for all those who have joined us online, and take care.